Thank you. Mr. Garrett, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In a town literally bursting at the seams with hyperbole and rhetorical bunk, I want to be really clear that what I'm about to say is my heartfelt feeling, and that is that in my 16 months here, I've gotten to know the ranking member of this committee quite well and could not hold him in higher regard as a human being. He's as fine a man as I know here. With that said, I want to speak to the repeated suggestion that charter schools lead to segregation by way of working towards a question. Ms. Reese's stated goal for charter schools was, quote, high-quality public education. I look at a legal analysis and the heartbreaking tragedy that was Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, which institutionalized the idea that segregation was somehow okay. And I've spoken at some length with the ranking member, and we share a passion for a 16-year-old girl in Farmville, Virginia in 1951 named Barbara Johns, who let a student walk out that became the only student-initiated case amalgamated into Brown versus Board of Education, wherein it was a start towards dismantling the ridiculous legal lie of Plessy versus Ferguson. That was finalized in 1964 with the passage of the Civil Rights Act and subsequent legislation. And as it relates to the sort of partisan barbs here, I would remind folks that 39% of Democrats in the House opposed the Civil Rights Act, while 20% of Republicans. In the Senate, 27% of Democrats opposed the Civil Rights Act, while 6% of Democrats. And there was actually a filibuster of the Civil Rights Act by one Robert Byrd, who, a presidential candidate, later called her mentor and a great leader and gave a kiss on the cheek with knowledge of the fact that he had formerly been a member of the Ku Klux Klan. So, segregation is illegal, has been since 1964, and if you'd like to give partisan credit, you can do that based on the mathematical facts that I outlined. And so to use the term which absolutely and rightly stirs emotion, segregation, I think is hyperbolic at best and a little bit disingenuous at worst, because segregation is not the law of the land. So if indeed there is increased segregation, it is then de facto segregation, which relies in its essence on two facts. Number one, that individuals in the United States of America have the ability to choose, wherein their socioeconomic status creates this wherewithal, where they live. And number two, that geographical compactness creates circumstances wherein we cut down costs, which is a driving factor in public education, by virtue of a reduction in transportation and service expenses, right? These are realities that we know. So to say charter schools boost segregation, I think, is not a really fair argument. Again, with the greatest respect for the individual, and I mean that sincerely. But I'll tell you, there's been a fight over charter schools that long predates my entry into this august body and will continue after my nearing departure, and that manifests itself largely in state legislatures. And I can give examples. For example, when I was in the Virginia State House, there was a fight to allow students, and I believe it was 6 failing school districts in the entire state, the ability to attend school in adjacent school districts, which was opposed along party lines and vetoed by a governor named McAuliffe for reasons like that stated by my now colleague in Congress, former State Senator Don McEachin, who said, well, I don't like the idea that there's a lottery, to which I responded, at least in a lottery, somebody wins. And I'm reminded of the circumstance that I read in the paper with great jubilance and joy of Darren Francois, I believe I'm pronouncing that right, in New Orleans, Louisiana, at the International High School, wherein Mr. Francois attended a charter school and was recently in the paper for having received admission to 83 colleges. African American and raised by a single mom, Mr. Francois broke any number of expectations against him to become a high achiever, empowered by virtue of education. You see, there's a debate that goes on and on about nature versus nurture, and I will tell you to a metaphysical certainty, I believe in nurture. That if you take a young person, regardless of their background, regardless of the color of their skin, regardless of who they love, regardless of how they worship, and you place them in the right circumstances, they will be able to succeed. That's America. That's the promise that is America. Now, it manifests itself in reality with socioeconomic disparities, et cetera, but I would argue that this de facto segregation is largely a result of socioeconomic circumstances and not of children who are failing public schools, but of public schools who are failing our children. And so I would argue that while charter schools are no panacea, as panaceas do not exist in any entity or region governed by fallible human beings, that there are outcome disparities that show that where all other things are equal, opportunity is increased and outcomes are better. Ms. Reese, would you concur with the bulk of my sentiment?
Since we're out of time, I believe so for the most part, yes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Garrett. Ms. Davis, you're